Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we explore the philosophy of Johann Gottfried von Herder. Johann Gottfried von Herder is one of the most important transitionary figures in German philosophy. Perhaps along with Fichte, Herder was actually one of the most influential philosophers after Kant, but is largely forgotten in the Kant to Hegel canonical study that dominates most philosophy departments and continental surveys. Nonetheless, Herder was instrumental in pioneering the genetic and organic, even holistic theory of culture and history, which would influence the rest of post-Kantian German Romanticism and idealism in the 19th century. Born in 1744 in what is now Poland, but was then part of the Kingdom of Prussia, Herder became a student at the University of Königsberg at 17 and studied under Immanuel Kant. However, while at Königsberg, he came under the more direct influence and guidance of Johann von Hamann, the poet-sage Magus of the North, and became his disciple, though never forgetting the teachings of Kant. Herder subsequently became a clergyman and literary critic, infusing ideas of teleology, theology, history, and nationalism together to bequeath his philosophy of culture, or in the German, Kultur. There are three aspects of Herder's philosophy of culture that I wish to highlight. First is his notion of organic holism and its root in language and the genealogies of families. Second is his anti-imperialism and broader anti-materialism aimed at curbing the British domination of Europe. Third is the implicit cultural relativism entailed in Herder's ideas and how the culmination of culture is cemented by the state and our unity to the state. Then we shall briefly pivot to understand why Herder sees the movement of culture and history as one and the same, and how this movement of culture and history, culminating in the arts, language, and politics of the constitutional state, begets the happiness and peace that all humans seek and are governed to actualizing. The origins of culture for Herder is the family writ large, that is the Volk, or the people. The Volk, with their specific language and bloodline from history and in history, constitute the life force, or Lebensgeist, the life spirit of the people. And as people assemble into tribe, and then community, and then eventually nation, language and the organic genealogy of the nation which is constituted in the people pulsates as the life spirit of the nation. Language and filial roots, the genealogy of peoples, are the very basis of the life of any nation. However, people who share the same Ursprach, the language or first language, have also been driven apart. This is due to problems of geography, superstition, as well as imperial conquest by alien forces. When a people, a nation, are entirely colonized and conquered, losing their language and ability to trace their genealogy, they become a dead people and a conquered nation. That, for Herder, is bad. Why, however, are the forces of language and family the basis of the Volk and of Kultur? People only gather together in communities in an organic fashion because only in an organic movement to community is there a harmonious understanding and peace among the people. Understanding and peace, according to Herder, is principally tied to language, the force for our understanding one another, and the filial or tribal solidarity and similarity of those around us. People who speak a different language from us therefore have a barrier erected from understanding, and people who descend from different lineages and genealogies also have a barrier that prevents peaceful coexistence. As people unite under a shared language and heritage, this unity developed by people serves as the springboard for the energetic creativity which is always reflected in the language arts, the creative arts, and the filial worship that people engage in. Literature and art, for instance, embody these primeval spirits of language and filial and tribal solidarity. Literature is the construct of a specific language, and art often depicts the sacred mythology, moments, and history of a very specific people. Herder's organic holism is irrevocably tied to his romantic nationalism. Herder was a nationalist. We might also say, perhaps more appropriate in our own day and age, that Herder was a populist. But Herder was not an imperialist, and this is something very crucial to know. In fact, Herder was a staunch pluralist and saw pluralism and imperialism as antagonistic to one another. All peoples and nations have the Ursprach genealogy that ought to be safeguarded, nurtured, and grown. Herder sought to defend the diverse plurality of peoples and nations against any homogenizing imperialism that might thwart it. In Herder's time, the biggest threat to the particularity of people were the imperialism of the Enlightenment philosophers. Herder's philosophy of culture has a very specific pro-Lutheran and anti-British and therefore pro-German sentiment to it. Lutheranism was the proper religion of the German not merely because it was Christian and therefore the truth, but because it allowed specifically for the linguistic flourishing of the German language in its vernacular translation of the Bible and its vernacular liturgy. Additionally, Germany should be for the Germans and not the English, or even the French. We must remember that in the mid and late 18th century, when Herder lived, much of Germany was under British imperial domination because the ruling house of Hanover descended from the Germanies and retained control over some of the West German principalities. Because British imperialism tore the German people apart and scattered them across the world, which destroyed their history, heritage, and identity in the service of a nation and kingdom antithetical to their own, British imperialism ought to be opposed at every level. This brings us to Herder's anti-imperialism and anti-materialism. For Herder, as with other German thinkers like Hamann and Fichte, the grounding of reality is spirit, for spirit is life. The crudity of the materialists, mostly emanating from Britain and France, destroy the creative genius that spirit brings. Spirit lifts us up to the heavens in the great chain of being, progress which inspires man to ascend to the stars and meet his maker face to face. Herder pioneers what Fichte later refined in his philosophy, a spiritualist idealism that enchants the world and gives us purpose and meaning, while fending against the reductionist materialism implied by the so-called Enlightenment philosophies of Bacon, Hume, and Voltaire. As Herder said of Voltaire in particular, Voltaire's philosophy has spread, but mainly to the detriment of the world. Why Herder's philosophy of organic holism is anti-imperialist should now become evident enough. Imperialism destroys the particularity of the Volk and erases the language and heritage of people as it swoops in and imposes a new language and identity over others. Additionally, imperialism's expansionist ideals are universalistic and not particularistic. Anything universalist necessarily conflicts with that which is particular. Moreover, people who are transplanted elsewhere, taken away from their sacred land where language and genealogy is closest to them, makes them a deracinated people susceptible for cultural annihilation. We see this today, especially in sociological studies of immigration and heritage retention. Immigrants and migrants who move very far away from their native nation, where the mother tongue of the language they speak is warmest, very quickly lose that identity and become assimilated into the foreign country they move to. Meanwhile, the reverse is true when immigrants and migrants move to a place that is very close to their own native land. When people move to a place that is very close to their own sacred soil and language, they much more likely retain that heritage and identity, and therefore expand it into the nations they move into. When people, like German soldiers used by the British imperial war machine, for instance, in Herder's time, are taken from the Germanies and cast into faraway lands in the Americas, these young men are aliens in the land they find themselves, and in the desire for acceptance and peace in the nation they now find themselves, they erase their identities to adopt the identity of the majority they find themselves with. This, however, is something tragic, since a German is a German and not an Englishman. No matter how hard he tries, he can never escape this reality, because man is generated into a world rather than created ex nihilo. Man descends from a long genealogy of circumstances, which births him into the world, and being at home with that genealogy, that genealogical generation, is an essential part of man's happiness. As such, people who lose connection with their organic past will forever be estranged people, strangers in a strange land. On this note, it is important to remember that in Lutheran theology, the official theology of the soul was traducianist. Traducianism in Christian theology is the belief that all souls are generated from the soul of Adam. Therefore, you can see how Herder takes this traducianist theology of the soul and uses it to understand the genealogies of mankind. Men are not self-makers and self-liberators, able to craft and create their own identity out of nothing. Man, as a creature, is generated into the world and can trace his genealogy back to a beginning. No matter how hard one tries, man can never escape the reality that he has a genealogy. Therefore, Herder argues, people should dwell in the richness of their particular heritage, history, and identity. They should contribute to the ever-evolving progress of their culture and creative spirit, and they should respect the heritage, history, and identity of other people. However, Herder also cautions against becoming infatuated with the culture of others. Herder asserts that we should recognize the cultural creativity and uniqueness of all people, while remaining steadfastly committed to the cultural creativity and uniqueness of our own people. As he says, the movement that men start dwelling in the wishful dreams of foreign lands, from whence they seek hope and salvation, they reveal the first symptoms of disease, of flatulence, of unhealthy opulence, approaching death. To mix cultures brings only destruction because it ruins the organic unity, that original organic holism that serves as the life spirit and creative genius of all particular peoples. Thus we see Herder's anti-imperialism in another light. Not only does he rebuff the conquest of foreigners upon natives, he also rebuffs the attempt to import, an alternative form of imperialism we know today as cultural appropriation, of foreign ideas into a native land. Only those who have become so deracinated from their own culture look upon other cultures with that curious spirit of hope and salvation, which is really a disease and flatulence approaching death. In short, a people and nation approaching death because they have cut themselves off from their own organic and cultural roots, become interested in the culture of others and seek to import that culture into their own, bringing irreparable harm to everyone involved. This turns us now to the fact that Herder was a cultural relativist. Personally, I dislike the term relativist due to the negative connotation that that term now has, and in many respects, our modern understanding of relativism doesn't do justice to the realities that Herder is describing. I would prefer to use the term particularist to Herder's cultural theory, because in my opinion, that is what best explains Herder's outlook. Every culture is particular to the particular people to which it belongs. Herder believes in universal realities, but those universal realities are instantiated in particular people through particular mythologies, through particular sacred histories, through particular literature and art styles, etc. Everybody, for instance, knows beauty, but beauty manifests itself differently in each particular culture. As such, each culture inevitably produces its own particular style in art, literature, and religious beliefs, which are best suited for them. There is nothing wrong with this, Herder also informs us. A German should embrace his culture. An Englishman should embrace his culture. A Frenchman should embrace his culture. The Chinese should embrace their culture, and the Japanese their culture, etc. The problem of the Enlightenment is its universalism, which necessarily and logically exhausts itself into imperialism. Thus, it is no surprise that the Enlightenment theorists, then and now, all defend and promote imperialist projects. Today's Enlightenment theorists promote what we call globalism. The fact that Germany was not imperialist for Herder was evidence of its goodness. Here we should stress that Herder never sought a Germany that would be mistress of the world, or even steward of the world. Herder simply sought a Germany for the Germans and believed the petty differences of history and prior conquest, which had carved up the Germanies into its many duchies and principalities, should be overcome, united under a German nation, while never losing the particular customs and laws to those cities and principalities. And this, of course, was the path taken by 19th century Germany, which was united under the leadership of the Kingdom of Prussia, but retained the older kingdoms and duchies and free cities as part of its national constitution. Because again, as culture and history unite, a national constitution is formed to protect that history and heritage. History for Herder is the organic movement and progression of cultural creativity to the formation of national states, which embody the Ursprung of life and bestow it to all of its citizens. Citizenship, then, according to Herder, is the highest aspiration of man. For Herder, history has two possible trajectories. Abundance for the few and comfort for the many is one, or happiness for all as all participate in the cultural and creative spirit of their nation. Abundance for the few and comfort for the many, he believed, was the universalist project of the Enlightenment in its materialistic economism, which reduced life to a petty struggle for economic well-being and comfort, especially as entailed and embodied in the British liberal tradition of Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke. Happiness for all, Herder believed, was the path offered by his vision of cultural romanticism, enchantment, and creativity, the spirit of life that moved from the Ursprung, which invited all people to dwell in the particularities of their communities and the creative genius contributing to the growth and project of all cultural pursuits, art, literature, religion, politics, law, etc. As Herder said, "Whatever a nation or race of men wills for its own good with firm conviction, and pursues with energy, nature will assuredly grant. This unitive energy that a particular people have will bring them into greater harmony with each other in that energetic pursuit of cultural growth and creativity. Herder believed this was the original purpose of the Ursprach, which brought people together in understanding and solidarity. We unite for a shared purpose, not individualistic purposes. We unite for a common goal, not individualistic goals. In that shared purpose, we find our destiny and meaning in life, which unites us with all our ancestors who came before us and ties us to all our posterity that will come after us in a grand waltz of harmonious creativity, tying past, present, and future together. The movement of history, for Herder, is the organic harmony consummated in the cultural creativity and dwelling of the cultural spirit. Readers of Goethe might see how Goethe drew from Herder's philosophy of culture, reaching back into the German mythological past and taking those stories and making them real in the present, updating them for today's Germans, is the task that all of us can partake in. Readers of Hegel and even Heidegger should also be able to see the traces of Herderian thought to both. History has a unitive purpose for moral community and the purpose of cultural dwelling that stands out in Hegel and Heidegger, respectively. These ideas are not unique to Hegel and Heidegger, but originate in the cultural theory of Herder. Herder influenced, perhaps paradoxically for many of us today, the Romantic nationalist movements of the 19th century, which did culminate in the horror of 2 world wars, and the cultural relativist and postmodern movements which praise cultural diversity, relativism, and multiculturalism. Yet both post-Herder movements rejected Herder's concrete philosophy. Herder's Romantic nationalism was anti-imperialist. It did not seek expansion, whereas 19th century Romantic nationalism after Herder's death often became imperialistic and sought expansion. Likewise, Herder's cultural particularism sought to recognize cultural diversity while refraining from any sort of multiculturalism or cultural appropriation. Herder saw a world of many people united with their own history and heritage, happily engaged in cultural creation, which would bring them meaning and happiness in their lives. He did not see and did not advocate a world where many people would shed their history and heritage and move to all the corners of the earth, and in doing so, destroy the old roots of culture which make life meaningful and purposeful once we dwell in them and contribute to their nurturing and growth. Lastly, this brings us to a recurring theme which I have covered in my various lectures on German idealism and romanticism, of the secularization or culturalization of Christianity in the German philosophies. Herder clearly secularizes the Christian story of divinization and salvation in his cultural philosophy. The joy that we find in God is now the joy we find in the creative spirit, the God of this world, the God in history. Herder's philosophy is a philosophy of divinization, joy, and life, and not decadence, death, and extirpation. Not to mention his whole notion of the Ursprach, the first language which brings understanding and unites us together in a life of joy and harmony, is the secularized instantiation of Genesis 1, where God spoke the world into being. And as I also mentioned, Herder's philosophy of genealogical progression in his understanding of man is based in his Lutheran theology of the soul. Yet Herder's optimism is constrained by the pessimism we briefly noted earlier, that in the rejection of one's own rooted culture, one embraces the disease of cultural deracination leading to death. As Herder also said, the alternative to his vision of cultural vitality and divinization is abundance for the few and comfort for the many. The Enlightenment vision of universal comfort and material prosperity. Herder obviously sees this parasitic philosophy as decadent and deadly. It is the lifeless corpse, feeding on mere food and water until it finally dies in a warm bed with a blanket, where all concern and consideration for cultural creativity and dwelling life itself has died, and we become mere economic animals concerned with the basis form of living, and that is no form of living at all. To live in the spirit of cultural creativity and dwelling is the life that man seeks and the life that man can find happiness in. If we could sum up Herder's philosophy, it would be that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Spirit.